We could talk about attacks on the office of the presidency, on the Electoral College, on the First Amendment, on the Senate itself. But most striking of all have been the shameless efforts to bully our nation's independent judiciary. And yesterday, those efforts took a dangerous and disturbing turn. By now, many already know what the Democratic leader shouted outside the Supreme Court yesterday morning. I'm sorry to have to read it into the record. First, he prompted a crowd of left-wing activists to boo two of the associate justices, as though Supreme Court justices were professional athletes and Senator Schumer were jeering from the stands. And then the senior senator from New York said this: "I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you've released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions." End quote. Madam President, I'm not sure where to start. There is nothing to call this except a threat. And there's absolutely no question to whom it was directed. Contrary to what the Democratic leader has since tried to claim, he very, very clearly was not addressing Republican lawmakers or anyone else. He literally directed the statement to the justices by name. And he said, quote, "If you go forward with these awful decisions," which could only apply to the court itself. The minority leader of the United States Senate threatened two associate justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, period. There's no other way to interpret that. Even worse, the threat was not clearly political or institutional. As I'll discuss in a moment, these kinds of threats are sadly nothing new from Senate Democrats. This was much broader, much broader. The Democratic leader traveled to the workplace of the two judges, and in front of a crowd of activists, he told those judges, "You will pay the price," right in front of the Supreme Court building. "And you won't know what hit you," he said, right in front of the Supreme Court building. If any American had these words shouted at them from a sidewalk outside their office, they would hear those threats as personal. And most likely they would hear them as threatening or inciting violence. That's how any American would interpret those words if they were directed at us. And that's certainly how the press and leading Democrats would have characterized them if President Trump or any senior Republican had said anything remotely similar. We've seen much more hay made out of much less. Perhaps our colleagues thinks this is absurd. Perhaps he would like the most generous possible interpretation, that he got carried away and didn't mean what he said. But if he cannot even admit to saying what he said, we certainly cannot know what he meant. At the very best, his comments were astonishingly reckless and completely irresponsible. And clearly, as the Chief Justice stated in a rare and extraordinary rebuke, they were, quote, dangerous, end quote. Because no matter the intention, words carrying the apparent threat of violence can have horrific, unintended consequences. In the most recent year on record, Madam President, the United States Marshal Service tracked thousands of threats and inappropriate communications against the judiciary. thousands of threats against the judiciary. Less than 3 years ago, of course, an unhinged and unstable left-wing activist attempted a mass murder of congressional Republicans at a baseball field right across the river. A Senate leader appearing to threaten or incite violence on the steps of the Supreme Court could literally be a matter of deadly seriousness. So, I fully anticipate our colleague would quickly withdraw his comments and apologize. That's what even reliably liberal legal experts like Lawrence Tribe and Neil Katyal have publicly urged. Instead, our colleague doubled down. Doubled down. He tried to gaslight the entire country and stated that he was actually threatening fellow senators, as though that would be much better. But that's a fiction. And then a few hours later, the Democratic leader tripled down. Instead of taking Chief Justice Roberts' sober and appropriate statement to heart, he lashed out yet again and tried to imply the Chief Justice was biased for doing his job and defending the court. Let me say that again. He tripled down and he lashed out yet again and tried to imply the Chief Justice was biased for doing his job and defending the court. Our colleague, therefore, succeeded in attacking 33% of the Supreme Court in a space of a few hours.